This video is the first in a series of 6 videos on blood. We're going to start just looking at some general concepts about blood in the sense of its properties and functions, and then how blood cells are produced. Then we'll move on to the specific blood cells and their functions, then hemostasis, and finally how we do blood typing in all this series of 6 videos. So first, let's start looking at the functions and properties of blood. First of all, you're going to see blood in lots of different chapters in your textbook related to their functions. Particularly, we'll come back to blood and how it's tied with respiratory system and transporting dissolved gases. We've already seen how digestive system, it uses blood to transport nutrients. We've seen endocrine system, how it transports hormones for the endocrine system. Urinary system, again, we'll come back to blood where we're going to see transport of waste, water, and pH balance in particular. And then lymphatic system, of course, the immune defenses related to white blood cells. And then finally, other things that the blood does is homeostasis. It's going to help in regulating your temperature or thermoregulation. It's going to help in restricting fluid losses at injured sites, so hemostasis or blood clotting function there. As I mentioned before, pH is a very important in component or function of blood, and so we'll come back to that again at the end, towards the end of the semester. And then finally, fluid and electrolyte balance. We're tied in with edema or blood pressure, so we'll bring that up when we do cardiovascular system, but we won't spend a lot of time with fluid and electrolyte balance in itself, simply because we don't have enough time this semester. Adults typically have about 4 to 6 liters of blood, and the pH of the blood is about 7.4 on average, so it's a little on the basic side. If we looked at the components of blood, this is what we're going to see. We've got 45% of the blood is made up of formed elements. These are going to be the cells or cell-like structures. Platelets are actually cell fragments, and we'll see what they look like later and how they're formed. Red blood cells, of course, are the most abundant of the formed elements, and then white blood cells are going to be important in our defense. Now, white blood cells come in one of 5 types, and we'll look at each one of those types and their roles as well. And then plasma makes up about 55%. This is the fluid portion of the blood. It's made up of all kinds of different things you can see listed here, and we'll look at some of those, particularly the proteins. That is the major proteins, albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. Now, to measure blood and see what portion of it is blood formed cells or the plasma, you do what's called a hematocrit. Basically draw blood up into a capillary tube, and then you stick that capillary tube in a centrifuge and spin that centrifuge. What that does then is forces all the formed elements, the cells, down to the bottom of the centrifuge tube, and then the plasma's up on top. So then we can measure the entire length of that tube for the total volume of blood, and measure the length of it that is formed elements versus that which is plasma. And so if I measure this whole thing, let's say it's 100 millimeters long, then 45 millimeters of that is going to be red blood cells, so that makes it a 45% of the entire blood is erythrocytes. 55 millimeters out of that 100 millimeter length would be white blood cells, so it's 55% of the whole blood. Now, there is a little teeny buffy coat in between that it's called, that contains the leukocytes and platelets. It's kind of hard to see, but it is a little teeny layer in there. So when you talk about a person's hematocrit, you're saying actually the percent of the total volume that's red blood cells. So if I said I have a hematocrit of 48, then 48% of my blood is red blood cells or erythrocytes. The higher the hematocrit, though, the more viscous, the thicker your blood is. And you don't want the hematocrit too high, because highly viscous blood, thick blood, won't flow through blood vessels as well, and then you can get clotting when you don't want clotting to happen. Now, the plasma is again composed of just the fluid portion of the blood, and then the stuff that's either suspended or dissolved in that plasma. So most of the plasma, 90% of it, is the water, And that, of course, is going to dissolve and transport the organic and inorganic molecules. And then 10% of that is the stuff that's dissolved in there. Now, what's the stuff that's dissolved, or I should say, or could think of as suspended in some ways, within there include the electrolytes, which is mostly sodium, but you're also going to see calcium and phosphate and chlorine and bicarbonates and all kinds of long lists of different kinds of electrolytes that would be in your blood. The nutrients, of course, so some of the vitamins, the minerals, the sugars, amino acids, those types of things. Organic wastes are found, like urea. These are typically nitrogen-bound types of things. The proteins, which make up about 7 to 9% of the plasma, most of those proteins is albumin. Then there's the globulins and fibrinogen, and we'll look at those again. Now, plasma has a composition very similar to interstitial fluid, and so it's going to have that same consistency that you see with any fluid in the body. Now, the non-protein components of plasma are going to include, as I mentioned before, the nitrogenous waste. These are things that come from the amino acids when we use them for energy sources, or we have to break down the tissues, the amino acids. They're typically include the nitrogenous waste like urea or toxic end products of catabolism, and these we want to get rid of from our body. We don't want those around, so we're going to excrete those through the kidneys. The plasma, also the non-protein parts, is going to also include the nutrients, and then some oxygen and carbon dioxide is transported in the plasma, but not very much. Oxygen doesn't, or carbon dioxide does not dissolve well in plasma. Remember, plasma is water-based. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are non-polar molecules, so they're not going to dissolve well in the plasma. And then, of course, the electrolytes, as I mentioned, most of which is sodium, but there's a few others that are in there. They're going to be important for what's called osmolarity, or maintaining the amount of fluid, whether something's hypertonic or hypotonic. So we want to make sure we maintain the fluid balance in our body. The plasma proteins are the part that we want to look at a little bit more detail. These are all the proteins that are formed by the liver, except hormones and gamma globulins, which are produced by plasma cells, or what were lymphocytes, one of the white blood cells. The gamma globulins are used in immune system functioning, and then of course hormones we've already talked about. Those, their signaling properties to get their target cells to do whatever function they need to do. Now, the different types of plasma proteins we find, there's basically three main types. Albumin, as mentioned before, this is the most abundant one of the plasma proteins. Again, it's made in the liver. It's going to contribute to the viscosity, again, how thick it is, and that osmolarity. We need the plasma proteins in there to help retain water so the water doesn't infuse out of the blood vessels, and therefore we lower our blood volume and therefore blood pressure, and that would be bad. So we'll see that later when we get to cardiovascular system. We'll spend more time thinking about albumin then. Now, fibrinogen is a precursor to fibrin, and fibrin is what makes up blood clots. So the liver makes fibrinogen so that when we get this cascading series of events happening, the end product or the end step of it is to convert fibrinogen to fibrin. And so we'll talk about fibrinogen's role more when we do hemostasis. And then globulins are the last of the major proteins, or plasma proteins. Again, these are made in the liver. Alpha and betas, I should say, are the ones made in the liver. These could be transport ions. They could include hormones, so we've got some that are going to be liver, some that are not, and other things that may have a low solubility in water or prevent loss at the kidneys. And then last, the gamma globulins. As I mentioned before, the gamma globulins are actually part of the immune system. Now, the formed elements that we see in blood are going to be the different cells. The erythrocytes, of course, are red blood cells. They're the most abundant one. We have 5 to 6 million of them per millimeter, or a microliter. The leukocytes are the white blood cells. There are 5 basic types, so we'll look at those types and what they do later on. And then the platelets, again, are really just cell fragments. They're barely cells in themselves, but we've got between 250 to 400,000 of them typically, and their functioning solely is for blood clotting. Now, the last thing I want to look at in this video then is looking at how blood cells are produced, and that process is called hematopoiesis or hematopoiesis. Hemopoietic tissue is what's responsible for producing the blood cells. Which cells or which tissues are responsible for making blood cells changes throughout our life. First of all, you've got the yolk sac. When we're little embryos inside of our mother's stomachs or uterus, the yolk sac is responsible for producing the stem cells. Those stem cells are the stem cells responsible for making blood cells, and so they start to colonize in the fetal bone marrow, liver, spleen, and thymus, and so those stem cells then will start making the blood cells for the fetus. The liver will stop producing blood cells at birth, but the spleen and thymus still are involved pretty much in white blood cell production, and then the spleen and the thymus will be throughout your life, will be involved in making white blood cells. But the spleen will lose its functioning as far as, or decrease, I should say, its function in making blood cells as you progress, as you get older and older. The primary guy responsible for making blood cells is going to be the red bone marrow throughout your life. Now, as a child, pretty much all of your marrow throughout your skeletal system will be red marrow. As you age, there isn't as big a demand for metabolism as you get older, so you don't need as much red blood cell, or you don't need as much red bone marrow making red blood cells or any other cells. Obviously, if you're higher metabolism in childhood, you have a higher oxygen demand, so you need more red blood cells. So you need more red marrow to make those red blood cells. Now, as you get older, you simply don't need all of that red marrow anymore. So it will be converted, a lot of that red marrow will end up getting converted to yellow marrow. So as an adult, typically where you're going to find red marrow is going to be in the vertebrae, the sternum, the ribs, the pelvis, and the proximal end of the limb bones, and that's the only place. Okay, again, childhood, you're going to see more red marrow distributed pretty much throughout the entire skeletal system, particularly the everywhere but the cranium. And the yellow marrow then is going to be where there is no hemopoiesis going on. Now, as an adult, let's say you hemorrhage, you have an incident where you lose a great amount of blood, so you have a high need for more blood. Well, a lot of your yellow marrow can get converted to red marrow in those cases, and so it will get converted so you can have a huge increase in the speed at which we make those blood cells, and then once that's recovered, that yellow marrow, or that, excuse me, red marrow will convert back to yellow marrow again. The stem cells that are involved in making blood cells is called a hemocytoblast. It multiplies continually, and it's considered to be pluripotent. That means it's capable of differentiating into multiple cell lines. So that one hemocytoblast can become a red blood cell, a white blood cell, or a platelet. So it can become a different types of blood cells. But once it's committed down one pathway, it's got to stick with that pathway. It can't go back and start to head towards a red blood cell and go, oh, so now I need more white blood cells, so I'm going to take those cells and make them into white blood cells. That doesn't work. The process of hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis stimulated by erythropoietin, that's a hormone that's produced by your kidney in response to low oxygen levels. So here's the cells that make up, or the kind of the family tree, so to speak, of all the different blood cells. So here's our hemocytoblast up here. Again, it's pluripotent and multipotent, same thing. That is basically it can differentiate into any one of these cells that are listed or shown here. So now when this hemocytoblast undergoes mitosis, one of the cells is going to either differentiate into a myeloid progenitor cell or a lymphoid progenitor cell. The other one stays a hemocytoblast, so that it can keep that pluripotent kind of characteristic, and then it will divide again and differentiate into one of those cells, either a myeloid or a lymphoid cell. Okay, so we always, in other words, have a hemocytoblast around. Actually, we have lots of them scattered throughout the red marrow, but at least for each cell, one of them stays a hemocytoblast, the other one will become one or the other lymphoid or myeloid cell. Now, if it becomes a myeloid cell, then it's committed to becoming one of the other cells down here. It could become a megakaryocyte, and the megakaryocyte is responsible for making platelets or thrombocytes. It could become a erythrocyte. It could become a mast cell. Now, a mast cell isn't considered a blood cell. It's not one of the blood-formed elements in blood. It's actually going to be involved in allergic reactions. So it never gets into blood circulation, so therefore that's why we don't call it a blood cell. Or the thing could become a myeloblast. Now, a myeloblast then is going to differentiate into one of these types of white blood cells. These are 4 out of the 5 types of white blood cells that are possible. And then if it becomes a monocyte, will eventually, I should say, become a macrophage as well. So lots of different cells. Pretty much all of the cells except the lymphocytes are going to be coming from the myeloid progenitor cell. The lymphoid progenitor cell is either going to differentiate into a natural killer cell. Again, this is not considered one of the formed elements because it doesn't go into our blood. It stays out of the blood. Typically resides in lymphoid tissue. And we'll see what his function is when we get to immune system. Or this lymphoid cell will become a lymphocyte, and the lymphocyte then could differentiate into either T lymphocyte or B lymphocyte, and the B lymphocytes become plasma cells. Now, right at this point in time, it's not important to memorize every single one of these cells because we're going to come back. You're going to get this whole family tree down pretty easily, simply because as we move from to other lectures, will be concentrated on the characteristics of each of the cells. So if you can just remember, lymphocytes come from lymphoid cells and all of the other cells come from myeloid cells, it's pretty set. It's pretty easy kind of family tree. It's not that hard. Okay. With that ends our little lecture on just basically characteristics. So the next video lecture, we're going to look at erythrocytes and see what they're up to.